Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, why there is no formula for TTRPGs. In the Wilds, the Rocks. And in the Tavern, what would you do if something died of old age? Well, how's it going today, everyone? I hope everybody out there is having an excellent day. Welcome to episode 49, almost halfway to 100. Hard to believe we're at this point already, but thank each and every one of you out there in the Plot Hooks family who's supported us over the past year plus. And I'm excited to dive today into a topic which is a little bit more theoretical than the topics that we generally like to cover, but I think it is important for us to be aware of and something that affects us in our regular storytelling nonetheless. Before we get into the Prime Material, though, just some announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on social media. You can find us at Plot Hooks on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And on Twitter, we're currently, as I record right now, only 10 followers away from launching our next giveaway in the quest for 1K. Excited to hit that milestone, so be sure to go over to Twitter and check that out. And to help spread the word about the podcast, not only does following us on social media help, but we'd love it if you could rate and review the podcast wherever you happen to download it. It helps spread the word about Plot Hooks to more and more people. It helps it show up on more and more podcast feeds for others to find us. And if you've gotten something really awesome from the show and would like to give back to it, we would really appreciate it if you would check out our Patreon. There's lots of awesome content up there at various different tiers. And if you could head over to the DMs Guild and check out Oath of Destiny. We haven't talked about it in a while, but that is our Paladin subclass, which is up there live right now. And as we speak, the copy editing has begun on our second release, Disaster Hamsters. And we're excited to be able to have that out for you soon, sometime hopefully in March. We genuinely appreciate your support. It helps us keep the lights on around here and keep producing content for you all. But with that out of the way, let's dive into the Prime Material. Today we wanted to talk about formulas, and specifically how there is no formula for tabletop role-playing games. This world in general is obsessed with formulas. We might not notice it, but we are. We don't look at it like we're doing things formulaically, but behind a lot of this world's systems, from the way we work to even the way we play some games, is the idea of finding the right formula. Whether it's the desire to be the most efficient and finding the formula to do that, or the desire to maximize our opportunities for fun or for profit, or whatever desire it may be, we love finding formulas to figure out the best way to do something. And not only that, not only do we love finding formulas at times for efficiency's sake, but we also love it for custom's sake. For the sake of having a societal norm, a certain way that different things are done. We connect with each other through these cultural formulas. They help us determine appropriate behavior in a given situation, and they give us a sense of predictability to our interpersonal interactions. And all this makes sense, right? We're inquisitive creatures, and we have that innate desire to maximize, to succeed. So we want to play the best, work the best, be the best. And we're also social beings, and we love to have formulas for the ways that things work between us. And there are lots of things to which formulas work. Lots of times where a formula can be beneficial. We can research and calculate and find the correct course of action in a game. We can figure out that we have to optimize this character first and then get this one, and that gets you this one, and figure out the optimal path to go through. Optimization is a big part behind the whole love of speed running, figuring out how to complete a game in the fastest manner possible. You want to find the smallest edge, the best path in order to get all the way through Super Mario Brothers or whatever it happens to be in the fastest manner possible. You're trying to find a formula to optimize. Even something as simple as directions. You research and determine the most optimized route to drive to a place, and then that's just the route we always use. That is the use inherently of a formula. So from its bluntest aspect, like the formula for the quickest way to calculate a mathematical equation, to its most abstract, like the social formula to how you greet one another, formulas are often beneficial. There's lots of things to which there is a beneficial, optimized solution within a given framework. But here's the thing. That's not the case in D&D. That's not the case in TTRPGs. There's no formula for them. There just isn't. There are a few different definitions of formula depending on exactly what field you're applying the word to, but in this sense, here's how Merriam-Webster's defines formula. It states, a customary or set form or method allowing little room for originality. And this definition calls into mind the problems that formulas often have, right? I said they're beneficial and good within a given limited framework. But there's a reason I described it as a given limited framework, because once you get outside of that framework, or the factors that make up that framework change, the formula is no longer valid. Formulas are inherently not flexible. They are what they are. And this rigidity can cause problems. Take a cultural formula, a greeting. In different parts of the world, you would do different things. Handshake, hug, kiss on the cheek. It all depends on your culture. Your society has a norm, has a formula for how that greeting looks. What would be accepted? What would be rude if it doesn't happen? What's the norm here? You have a formula for that. But what happens if you go outside of that society? That same formula looks foreign to those who are unfamiliar to it. The formula is no longer valid because it's no longer within its limited framework. Same thing with a more rigid formula, like a mathematical one. There might be a formula which works perfect and gives you the complete right answer 100% of the time in base 10, which is our normal counting method. But what about in a different base? What about binary, otherwise known as base 2? Will the same formula give you the correct answer? Possibly not. It's outside of its limited framework. So therein lies the problems with formulas for D&D and other TTRPGs. If we try to create a formula, we're trying to make a formula for what is fun across the millions of tabletops across the world. We're trying to come up with, to go back to the definition again, a customary or set form or method for playing D&D, allowing little room for originality. And we're trying to do that for a game that is played in millions of different ways. We can't do that. And I think this comes into clear focus when you look at the game from the perspective that we take here at Plot Hooks, the collaborative storytelling angle. TTRPGs are built around originality, built around individual creation, built around different people taking the exact same adventure or monster or rule set and telling their own collaborative narrative with each other. So we can't create a formula, because each individual table is its own limited framework. We can't make a set way to play. That doesn't exist. There's a reason that the official rules in D&D 5e leave so much up to the dungeon master's discretion. There's a reason that adventures leave so much room for creativity. There's a reason that there's a dungeon master to begin with. They're the steward of the story for sure. That's their main role. They're the ones setting the tasks to the party, but it's also true that there's enough variety in the rules and stories that the game inherently needs an adjudicator live on the scene. Monopoly doesn't need that. There's a formula for how it works. It's just called opening the rulebook that says Monopoly on it. But there's no set way to play D&D or any other TTRPG. The optimal way to play is going to vary wildly from one group to another. Some might care more about the best way to min-max their characters, to create the most powerful sorcerer or warlock or wizard that they possibly can. Some might care next to nothing about the rules and are merely following them loosely as they use their particular written rule set of that TTRPG as simply a vehicle to help them tell their particular story. Some might accept some parts of D&D or another TTRPG while not accepting others, such as not paying attention to too much of the social rules of Dungeons & Dragons, but paying really close attention to the combat mechanics. Every single group is different. Every single group is its own limited framework. So we can't create a formula. There is no formula. There is no book that we can write that gives you the best way to play Dungeons & Dragons, or the best way to play Pathfinder, or the best way to play Call of Cthulhu, or whatever it is. That just doesn't exist. So what's the point of talking about this? Why does this matter? Well, I think it matters for a couple of reasons. First, I think we simply have to always remind ourselves of this fact. We have to constantly call it to mind, because it is so easy, I know at least for me, to get into that mindset that the way that we like to tell stories is the optimal way. That our method of playing Dungeons & Dragons is the formula for the best way to tell collaborative stories. But that's not the case. And we have to remember that. It's easy, especially as an entrenched role player, somebody who's been doing it for so long and has so much experience and has even tried it in multiple different ways, to look at someone playing a TTRPG differently than us and to think in our heads that we could do it better, that we have a better formula than they do. But we have to guard ourselves against that thought. We have to remind ourselves that there is no formula. The second reason why I think this matters is it's very important to discuss when we create with others for the first time. When we're starting a new campaign with a group of players we haven't played before, whether we're the dungeon master or if we're just one of the players, we have to communicate what kind of story, what kind of game do we all want to tell. We have to talk about that with each other, because if we just assume that we're all going with our own preferred method, if we just internalize that, okay, I have my formula and this is how this campaign is going to go, then it might be disappointing. Of course, if you've been playing with somebody for a long time, maybe your interests are much more aligned with somebody. But if we don't communicate with somebody, especially if it's someone who we haven't played with before, we're not necessarily going to be on the same page. We could get a few episodes into the campaign, and the goals that each player has, or the goals that the DM has versus what the players have, there's a fracture there. And if you aren't on the same page, it can be hard to work together to tell a great story, because the formulas that you want, that you're all adhering to, are different. Now, some of that can be just overcome through communication even after the fact. No one person is the focus all the time. And so if this arc over here wants to follow the bard and this arc over here wants to follow the rogue, and those are two kind of different ways of tackling a story, then maybe that perfectly works out okay. But without communication, without empathy, then it can go downhill. So we really have to make sure that this is something that we talk about whenever we're first starting a new campaign or a new story in some way, shape, or form. That way we can all figure out together what kind of story is best for our group, or how to balance it if there's different desires in mind. It will save a lot of difficulty down the road. Thirdly, this matters a lot when we create for others. When we're writing content, especially adventures, there's no set formula. Of course, the storyline we create or the particular subclass that we generate or what have you will be more appealing to some and less to others. That's just the nature of the beast. Some people would love to see a horror narrative, some people don't. But as we create, we should try to make the things that we make, whether it be subclasses or adventures or monsters, we should try to make them flexible, not set everything in stone. Leave some things open-ended. Leave some things to where it can be taken by another DM or another player and used to tell a really interesting story of their own. We want other people to be able to come along and run these adventures, run these monsters, with the freedom to make it fit within their own Dungeons & Dragons preferences. If we don't create with this in mind, if we create thinking that the way that we play Dungeons & Dragons is the only formula, then we're going to end up creating very narrow content that fits only within the gameplay of those with philosophies like our own. So this matters. Understanding that D&D does not have a set formula matters. We have to always remember that the way that we like to play the game, the way that we think is the best way to play Dungeons & Dragons, is not a formulaic solution. I know I've faltered a lot in this realm myself. I know I haven't communicated great in this realm before. But I hope all of us can really make an effort to take this concept to heart and make sure that we're not dictating a set formula for how a TTRPG should work onto another person or group. But we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I always post a announcement on all of our social media that this episode has gone live. Go to that post and comment on it. Let us know what you think. Let us know your experiences with this or any tips that you have for avoiding this mindset. We'd love to hear from you. For now, though, this is about all the time we have on this week's Prime Material. Let's head out into the wilds and into the skies. We're out here in the wilderness, and we're high up in a mountain, looking at the most biggest of birds, the roc. The roc, at its core, is a giant bird. Doesn't sound like the most interesting creature, but you know what? A giant bird can actually be used pretty greatly in stories. I love just the visual of it, the classic of this bird being so ginormous but flying so high that its silhouette just looks like a normal bird, but then it swoops all the way down and its immense size is completely and totally visible and absolutely terrifying. These monstrosities, which are gargantuan in size, literally have a wingspan of 200 feet or more. The most giant of birds. And speaking of giants, there's actually a connection to giants within the Rock's lore. And this goes into one of the interesting ways that I think you can use them in a story. The Monster Manual states that in the ancient days, when giants battled dragons for control of the world, Anam, the father of the giant gods, created the rocks so that his worshippers might challenge the dragon's dominance of the air. When the war ended, the rocks were freed from giant domination and spread throughout the world. I love this lore. I love the idea of perhaps the party coming across this in action, not necessarily with the exact same setup of them being ruled by giants and created by the father of the giant gods, but having a rivalry between these giant birds and the giant reptilian dragons is a fascinating concept. Having a rock fight a dragon is an amazing visual, and can you just imagine a story where there's a war going on between those two factions? You could even make the rocks intelligent. They're just an intelligence of 3 normally, but if you wanted to really play that up, you could bump up that intelligence and make them intelligent creatures so they can actually talk to one another and talk to the dragons as they're fighting with one another. I think that would be a fascinating visual and fantastic way to set up a story. However, despite the kind of pipe dream of seeing a whole sky full of dragons versus a whole sky full of rocks, just like dragons, rocks are solitary creatures. They live in giant nests on the tops of mountains, hunting for food, and of course, for them, they need a lot of it, so they're looking for things like giants or massive sea creatures or elephants or things like that. Interestingly, it does hunt from a very long way away, so they could be a great creature to use in the classic trope of the animals are disappearing from this town. They were actually used in this method in Campaign 1 of Critical Role. They also tend to end up with a lot of valuables in their massive nests because, as a 200-foot wingspan bird would do, they can just scoop up in their talons some caravans or massive ships or all sorts of different things, and after the food is gone out of it, the remnants of those objects is just left inside of the nest, and the rock has no interest in any of the trinkets or anything that's in there. So perhaps the party needs to acquire something, and it happens to be inside of a rock nest. Maybe they knew the ship that it was from, and the ship got taken away by this rock, and now they've got to scale a mountain, get into its nest, sneak around, not alert it, and search through the nest trying to find the little locket that they were looking for and the remnants of the captain's quarters stuck underneath a bunch of giant twigs. Of course, there are also just amazing visual combat encounters with the party. They're a CR 11, 15 AC, 248 hit points, with a fly speed of 120 feet. Their main stat is Strength, with a +9 at a 28. Their next is Constitution with a +5 at 20, and everything else is pretty much average. Average Dex, average Wisdom, -1 on Charisma, and then, of course, that 3 Intelligence. They're rather perceptive creatures, but not as perceptive as you might think. They've got a +4 to their perception for a passive perception of 14, and of course, they do have advantage on Wisdom perception checks that rely on sight as an eagle-eyed bird, but that's still lower than I would have expected. The big thing with these, though, is the ability to carry party members off. Every turn they get to make 2 attacks, one with their beak and one with their talons. And the talon one is the interesting one here. If it hits, the target is grappled, and until the grapple ends, the target is restrained, and the rock can't use its talons on another target. And the escape DC is 19. So with 120-foot fly speed, this creature can swoop down into the middle of your party, grab the barbarian, and just coast right on out of there, taking a few attacks of opportunity while it goes, but unless somebody's got Sentinel, it could just peace out with the creature it snatched if it wanted to. And it can get so high up that the creature isn't even really going to want to escape because it'll take so much bludgeoning damage on the fall. So it can end up creating some very fascinating chase scenes as well. I personally have not had an opportunity to use one of these in one of my campaigns, but I really want to be able to. There's also just a really cool amount of lore that you could build into your own world that you could just make up about giant birds to come up with your own reason why they're here. Lots of opportunities to tell great stories. But I think I've had enough time out here being carried by this giant bird. Let's be dropped down over here at the tavern and grab some refreshment. All right, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook. What would you do if something died of old age? We don't get that a lot in D&D. We don't see a character or a character's pet or a family member or some prominent NPC. We don't generally see people die of old age in role-playing games. If you die, you generally died in battle, or you were assassinated, or you got sick, had some sort of disease. I mean, legitimately, think back in your stories to the last time that something in your collaborative narratives just passed away of natural causes, just because they were getting old. For me, I think the answer is literally never. And there's a reason for that. We want to tell heroic stories. And while we might have characters' parents pass away because they're getting older, if something is intimately involved with the story, we want a heroic purpose. We want, if a character's going to die, that we have the opportunity as players to rise up and bring somebody to justice. A king is killed, we want to be able to search out the monsters responsible and stop them from doing that to anybody else. We want to have a heroic bent to a death in our narratives. But in the right circumstance, something just dying of old age could be an interesting story point. You could have a ranger with an animal companion, which started at the beginning of the campaign as an older animal. And perhaps part of their character growth, part of the arc of the campaign is them trying to actually help the animal stay alive. But over time, the animal just succumbs to old age and they fail. And maybe then the character has to figure out that they can do things on their own. Or perhaps the character has to go out and get another animal companion, or perhaps this is just something that's really difficult for them to overcome. What about an NPC, a old shopkeep that just happens to pass away just because of their age? A new person has to be brought in to run the shop that these party members are always frequenting. They've got to learn a lot about this new person. Maybe this new person is related to the person that passed away, and maybe now they learn something that they never quite knew about this person in life. And maybe that inspires them to better themselves, because now all of a sudden they realize that this person behind the scenes was helping the poor all this time, and now somebody has to step into this void and carry on the work for the people that they were doing. Of course, any subject of death has to be handled with great care and respect, but I think it could be refreshing and just an interesting plot point to consider to have something die of old age. Really, when that happens, the focus gets put on the person itself. A lot of times whenever we just have these stories end in violent deaths, then there's not really much mourning. There's not really much focus on the person at all. It's an instant move on. Okay, that person is dead now. Now we have to go get justice, or now we have to go slay the monsters that did this. It's an instant move from this character passing away to it turning into a quest. And there's nothing wrong with a quest as a result of a character passing away, but I think to a certain extent that sometimes we lose some of the respect and potential story for that particular character. They get glossed over as essentially a quest starter. And perhaps having somebody die in old age is a change of pace which might be very beneficial to a story. But I think that's about all the time we have today on this episode of Plot Hooks. Thank you all very much for joining me. Remember to check out our Patreon, check out our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Check out Oath of Destiny on the DM's Guild, and stay tuned to our social media for updates on the incoming Disaster Hamsters. And as always, thank you all very much for listening. From all of us here at the Plot Hooks team, I'm Samuel. Thanks from Mike, Matt, Steve, Dave, Zach, Becca, and of course, Podcast Pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.